to distinguish between those things in the Republic which are applications and those that are principles. But the applications are always very interesting. They lead you to you wonder why he made that application, and you can speculate about yourself, but you don't have to say this is something that Socrates held as a doctrine.
I know there are some people who, when they get to the community of lives, close the book and say, well, this is an immoral book, or they accuse him of communism and so forth. You hear that kind of criticism from conservative Christians very frequently, that Plato was an evil man because he advocated communism and the community of lives. And it's a failure, seriously, I think, to read the book, because the principles that he puts down here are essential to thought. Right? Just as farmers are essential to society, a principle like the principle of simplicity is essential to serious conversation, to serious thought about anything at all.
Well, Socrates will often he speculates about a lot of things, like the what do you call it? The return of souls. You know, a navy that there's soldiers, but there isn't a trades class. There are tea
and coffee and imports from India and silks from China. No, he said, the minute you get into that, you're going to get into luxury, and when you get into luxury, you're going to get into disorder. People are going to care more about their pleasures than they are about their work. And he keeps coming back to that necessity of work. When he says that the philosopher becomes king, and when he uses the word aristocrat, whatever you do, don't get any idea of some kind of luxurious life where the rich people exploit the poor. Everybody's poor in this state. The philosophers, in fact, are poorer than anybody else.
They're the poorest. That's what I was going to say. They own no property at all. Remember, the guardians.
They're really like monks.
Yeah, the guardians come out of or the philosopher king comes out of the guardian class. He has received the education of the guardian, which means that he has been subjected to an extremely austere regimen since the time he was a little child, a long period of a very intense, what we would call physical education, what the Greeks called gymnastic, and a long period of the reading of poetry and of music, the study of music, and a long period of the study of mathematics, and finally of logic, and ultimately quite late in life the study of philosophy. It's a lifetime of a very hard study and leading a very austere life with no luxuries whatever. Indeed, with just the barest of necessities. Living outside, for example, you remember he says, well, the guardian is someone who lives outside. He doesn't even live in a house at all because he's tough and strong. And if he can't take it, then he dies. Really, that's what it amounts to.
See, we can start out here with these rules. If we want justice to prevail, it's rather surprising. The very first consideration turns out to be poverty. That's the very first consideration. That is, you cannot have justice if you want luxury. That's it. It's a choice you have to make. If you want to lead a luxurious life, you're not going to have justice. And that's that. It constitutes a principle of order. It has to do with, we would call it the minimum. That is, never too much, nothing in excess. The minute you overproduce, the minute you get yourself into an economic order where the ideal is to have a gross national product, the pun is famous, if not infamous. National products are gross. they're what the very thing that ruins us. That idea that we need more and more and more. Socrates begins right away with cutting it back to the least. It's a marvelous principle. We have a dying cat here now too. I bet that gets on the tape. Poor old thing. Someone is likely to think that one of us has got tuberculosis or something here, but it's a poor old cat, and we've had dogs barking out there. Dogs are guardians, so we need the dogs. I don't know what Plato would say. I think a cat is a luxury. At this moment, I'm inclined to get rid of that cat. But no, that's not true. The Carthusians have cats. They have a whole breed of cat. So there must be something contemplative. Memento mori, that's what it is. It's a reminder of death to listen to that cat cough like that. Well, you remember Thoreau, for example, starts out with that principle. And I suppose you might say he got it from Plato. I don't mean that he necessarily read Plato and then sat down and went to Walden, but that's the fundamental principle of his famous experiment. That is, what is the least that I need in order to be a man? And you remember, Thoreau goes pretty far with it. He cuts himself back to almost nothing. Plato doesn't go that far. That is, Plato doesn't argue. My gosh, I think I was going to say that one of the things that Thoreau didn't have was a telephone.
Well, one of the things I was going to say is the thing about luxuries is they're a distraction. They distract you. And,
you can't talk about philosophy.
No.
It's obviously true.
They divert you from your work. They interrupt you. You're always finding that you can't attend to your work because you have the luxuries draw you away from your work. You begin to ask yourself, well, do I really need to be doing this? Is this really important? Is this good? See, we always come to that question again. Is this thing that I'm doing really good? And it's very hard to answer that question. You always have to say, well, what is the purpose of a man? We say, well, what is the purpose of life? It's a very, very difficult question to answer. And one of the ways to go about answering it is to say, well, one thing we can see is that there are a lot of unnecessary things that are cluttering up our lives, and we need to reduce those distractions and try to get back to basic things. We talk about that in education all the time. Back to basics. We say, well, kids ought to learn mathematics, a little arithmetic, and they ought to learn reading and writing. Those are essentials. Another thing is to talk about essentials. That's rather a philosophical word, in fact. We talk about the essential. What is essential in a thing? And that always, the opposite of that is something unnecessary. There's something necessary, and then there are unnecessary things. And the right kind of a life always involves doing the necessary things and getting rid of everything that's unnecessary.
It's such a simple principle, isn't it? And yet, it's, again, like most principles, there it is. It's plain as the nose on your face, but nobody pays any attention to it whatsoever. To introduce, for example, into the United States today, the principle of it used to be called the principle of economy, although words have changed their meaning.
Yeah.
They used to use that word in the sense of, well, he's a very economical person, meaning he doesn't spend too much money or something like that. But the principle of economy is used in every field. If, for example, you have two different ways of doing something, both of which will achieve the end, the norm is to choose the simpler of the two. In mathematics, that principle of economy holds. If you can work out two demonstrations in a series of formulas, but the one is simpler, you choose the simpler. It's a universal principle.
That's one of those. I was trying to remember Thoreau's phrase, and you gave it when you used the word simple. One of the famous quotation is simplify. Simplify. He said that was his advice.
I couldn't remember
universal
that.
advice. The two, he repeated it. Simplify simplify, or maybe he said always simplify. I don't remember, but I think he just used that word, and that's true. That's true. That really is true. We're not,
I mean, he of course carries it to an extreme. Remember, he wouldn't even chop his wood. He said you could just open the front door and stick the log in the house and burn one end of it. He goes pretty far with it. But there we are with a principle of social order that is simplify. And when you do, you go back to basics. You discover this. Well, yes, in the economic order, we have to eat. Man is an animal who eats. And you have to eat in order to be healthy. And so what you need is a good, healthy diet. All right, what's the rule of diet? Well, anybody will tell you, simplify. That is, a luxurious diet is not healthy. It may be elegant, it may be delightful in some ways, but the simplest diet, good grains and vegetables and some meat, since we are carnivorous animals, or omnivorous animals, but your diet should be minimal. There's no need any more than there is for dancing girls. There really isn't any need for sherbet. There isn't any need for ice cream. The modern poet, boy, what an answer to Plato. You know the line I'm thinking of.
Stevens.
Stevens.
Yeah.
The only emperor, he says, is the emperor of ice cream. Now, nobody knows what he really meant by that line. I don't suppose that he really knows. But we could borrow it and put it up here as the exact opposite of the philosopher king. That is, the emperor today, not of ice cream. The emperor is ice cream. That is, we have an economy which is entirely based upon the idea of consumption.
Well, that's exactly the word I was going to use, consumption. We talk about that word rather blithely. We talk about consumerism now. We put an ism on the end of it. But that is really true. That is, that what we are consumers. We're consumers. We're a great mouth that just consumes, and it has an endless appetite. It can never be satisfied. This emphasis on the consumer, and of course it has the idea of a kind of destruction in it. That is that.
Well, it does.
We talk about the disease called consumption. And so we used to talk about tuberculosis.
And we eat up the world. We do eat up resources.
We devour the resources of the world. We lay the world waste. Really, that's what's happened. It's very obvious that that's what happened, and it's what is called the consumer society, and it started primarily, really, with the Industrial Revolution, what we call the Industrial Revolution, which was one of those very great social revolutions, a real revolution. It changed what had been a society, we'd say, from the time of Plato and the Greeks. Society was what we call an agrarian society. It was based on agriculture, based on simply the necessity for eating. The great broad base of all societies was the agricultural societies. Now there were hunting societies before that, but they were not really civilized societies. They were nomadic, wandering tribes.
They didn't produce enough. They were below the minimum.
Yeah, they were not. It wasn't adequate.
That's the trouble with Thoreau. I think he goes below.
Yeah, he tries to go to a kind of primitivism.
Primitive, yeah.
And many people are attracted to that now.
Subhuman.
Yeah. But society in general, in all of society, has been
Thoreau
based
didn't
on
have a family,
agriculture.
for example. There was no way that he could have lived in Walden if he had a wife.
Exactly.
I remember I was crazy about Thoreau when I was a young fellow, and my wife never liked Thoreau. She'd always say, "Well, it's all well and good to talk that way, but I want a kitchen, and I want if I'm going to have children, we will have to have this and that." And that's certainly true. The romantic, we mentioned Thoreau. Rousseau is the great European advocate of it. They drop below the level of the human and get into the savage, the noble savage. The idea that really that you don't need a normal family and a village life.
But you don't really need to have a house even. You can live in a tent, and you can move. And because, of course, the climate changes, wherever you are, usually if you're in New England, it gets pretty cold in the wintertime, and the tent isn't adequate, so what you have to do is move to Florida.
And that's what the hunters do.
Yeah, they move off to find game and move to a place where life is more comfortable and keep on the move.
But the babies are born on the move, and the papoose sits on there's no home, there's no cradle, there's no hearth, none of those things that are necessary.
Well, there really isn't a society. It really isn't a society at all. And so
So Plato starts with the minimum, but the minimum is a certain human level. I remember, though, you were talking about that idea of consumerism in a conference once on overpopulation, where people were arguing for the necessity of birth control, the necessity for population control. And the argument goes that every time a child is born, and of course we all have the statistics that there are so many thousands born every minute, and that of course when they grow up to childbearing age they're going to have children, and so they have these great marching formulas about the increase in population. And they argue that every time a child is born, a consumer is born. And there was a naive fellow at this conference who raised a very interesting question. He said, well, I understand what you're saying, that every time a child is born, but you seem to be saying that a child is nothing but a mouth. He said, every time a child is born, after all, a brain and two hands are born. that is, why don't you look at it that way, that maybe things could be made, things could be constructed. And it sort of put a stop on the whole argument. No one had ever thought of that before. Absolutely never thought of that.
Yeah, well, especially the absence of hands. That is, the idea is, of course, that there is work and that people produce things. That is, that members of society, you see, the idea is if everybody does their work, then they produce something, or they provide some service. But we know that we live in a society where there are vast numbers of people who produce nothing at all. They do nothing. They only consume. There are all kinds of people.
And they're the ideal, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, we all want to be in that class. That's the leisure class, as we call it. Incidentally, we started out with the idea of philosophy as leisure, or the school as leisure. And here we are into work, and we'll have to put those two together. The reason, well, we can't do that today. We'll have to get back to that. Yeah. That's a big one.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about here is that work is the necessary antecedent of justice. It's true, though, that the purpose of work is leisure.
Yes.
That is when you finish your work, then you function freely as a man. Whereas for us, the purpose of work is to feed mouths. That is, we perpetually go around in circles. We have a consumer society, and the consumer is the end. Consumption is the end, yes. And work is a means to the end of consumption. Whereas Plato turns that all around, converts it completely, and says, no. The purpose of work is that leisure will result.
Well, and of course, leisure is not just wasting your time.
And consumer, you consume only in order to work.
Yeah.
The purpose of eating is that you'll be able, that you'll be able to be a man. You're not a man in order that you're able to eat. But the cornflakes company thinks that you are.
Consumer of all things, consumer of entertainment, consumer of everything.
Or even of ideas, which is one of the reasons why we have this terrible desire for new philosophy every week.
Well, as I was saying to you before we started, the idea of education as information. That is, we become consumers of facts and of data. We cram our children's minds with data, or at least ideally that's what we aim to do. We think that constitutes education. Have them learn, Japanese and Italian and Spanish, and learn computers and learn how to do electronics and take every kind of course under the sun, simply to cram them with information. They simply are consumers of what we call knowledge, which has been quantified, of course, under that concept, because you can only consume that which is quantifiable. But that's not that's not
education.
That's not education.
In fact, Plato's education again is very minimal, very simple. You have music, drawing, the elementary subjects, reading and writing,
yes,
counting. That's about it. Very little. And as you move up the ladder into higher studies are not. It's not a proliferation of study at all. In fact, he uses the word synopsis when he talks about entering on into the philosophical life. He says that philosophy is essentially synoptic. That is something that brings widely scattered things together into more simple. The higher you go, the simpler it gets. It doesn't mean the easier. But the higher you go in study, the greater the simplification, rather than the complication.
No, we value complexity in everything. We really tend to say that the more complex the food that we eat, the more complex the governmental system is, the more complex our life, or the music, or the art.
A thing like the Gregorian chant, as opposed to a modern symphony. Plato would be on the side of the chant. He believes you want to learn how to play the lyre and sing, but you don't need too much music. You don't need too much literature. He thought a few poems are best. Whereas in our courses in literature at the universities, you have to take courses, you have to pass tests, you have to know everything. You have to have read thousands and thousands of books. For Plato, there were no books at all. Literature was that which you could memorize. And while they memorized quite a bit, and still, compared to a modern literary curriculum, it was almost nothing.
Yeah, well, we pride ourselves in especially we live in an age of what they call the media, and we're very proud of the fact that we can turn on the radio or the tape player or the phonograph, and we can listen to the whole, all of the music of the world. We can have a vast library filled with all of the great composers of the world. We can sit down and listen to them all over and over and over and over again. Again, Plato would say, well, what for? Why are you doing that?
We have no music of our own.
Yeah.
We have all the music of the world, and we have none of our own. That is, we are not a musical people. We don't sing. Maybe we talked about this before. I don't remember whether we did or not.
So.
But we came to that realization very early on in our course here at Kansas, that we had a group of students on a bus, and the bus driver went away singing songs. We were in Greece at that time. We went on a trip to Greece to look at this world that Plato actually lived in, to walk on the same streets that Socrates walked on. And we were riding on a bus, and the Greek bus driver sang his songs, and then he said, well, now, you Americans, you sing your songs. And we couldn't do it. One student started a couple of phrases, but he couldn't go on with the song. Someone started Home on the Range, but didn't get much beyond Where the Deer and the Antelope Play. Someone else started this or that. They even tried singing at that time the Beatles or whoever it was, who were the most popular hits of the day.
But they didn't know those.
And they didn't know those either. No. And although it turned out to be yeah, it wasn't too hard. That is, they weren't really songs. There was a lot of noise. Although maybe some of them were simple little lyrics, but as you say, they didn't know those either. Because when you have the record, you play it over and over again, but you don't sing it. I think we'll have to make the statement. We have all the music in the world. Anybody today has at his fingertips, with his stereophonic recorders, has at his fingertips more music than anybody has ever had in the history of the world.
Well,
we're not a musical people.
No. You see, you say if you speculate. I was speculating the other day. I wonder how much music Beethoven had Really, he didn't have a radio. He didn't. How many symphonies can you listen to when it's simply live music? I mean, even in Vienna, even in a place where there is a great deal of music, after all, music is not something you simply hear every day of your life. Even if you're a great musician, that is, for one thing, Beethoven didn't have the entire repertoire of music after Beethoven. You see, we have available to us all of the music stretching back.
We didn't have Wagner, thank God.
No Wagner, and we consider ourselves to be richer than Beethoven was, or than any of the other composers, because after all, they were really very provincial people. They lived in a very small world, and they didn't know what was going on in music in Italy.
He never traveled, really.
No.
Again, now, within 50 years,
yes,
they started going to Spain and Italy, and you got the Spanish beat and the melodies, and Mendelssohn started writing Spanish melodies. But we go back even to Beethoven. He had his own tradition, pretty much his own tradition. Within that. And it was a very strong, powerful tradition. But he didn't have Oriental music. He didn't have primitive music. We've been all over the world now, and we blend millions of different cultures.
Well,
how many cultures does a man need?
Well, again, it's that eclecticism,
and we have none.
We have, and eclecticism means that ultimately you have none. You have no choice. You don't choose anything at all. You just have. You try to embrace everything, but when you embrace everything, you embrace nothing. It's like trying to embrace, all of the women in the world or all the men in the world. You say, well, but that's not love.
No, you need a wife.
You need a wife. You need a husband, and that's that.
And again, we're rambling around, talking, conversing, turning around a single point here. We've been doing it for 15 or 20 minutes now. This is the point of economy, of simplify. What a marvelous principle that is. That is, pick up any subject in the world and ask yourself, well, what is the simple truth of this? If only we could do that. I'm going to identify clarification with simplification. It's a marvelous principle. Now, of course, Socrates does concede things. He says, well, once you establish the minimum, there's no harm in adding a little more. That is, there's no harm in introducing things for good reason. For example, you have to have farmers, but then there are different kinds of farmers. Some of them may become fishermen, and some of them may become foresters and lumbermen, and others may become truck farmers, and some might, become stock farmers. You do begin to get differentiation, and that is bound to happen. That is, there is a principle in nature which is opposed to simplicity. That is, you cut back to the root, and what does it do? It grows and it branches and it flowers. And so we do see here a principle of fecundity, a principle of growth and elaboration, and an origin in simplicity. And there's where we are when we consider the necessity of having a governing class. Because the question does come up, why can't you just have farmers and craftsmen and soldiers? Why do you need governors? And the reason is that simplicity doesn't last.
Well, the simplicity ultimately simply means, it means one. That's what simplicity means. Something that has no parts at all.
Yeah.
That's something that's really simple, has no parts. It's like number one is the simple. It's indivisible. That is the number, and that's the simple number. And two obviously can be divided into two ones, and so forth and so forth. You say, well, why can't we just have an agricultural society? Why do we need craftsmen at all? Why don't we just have farmers? You say, well, it won't work. It won't work. There is a division that takes place. It is a kind of complication, because complication means folding something over into two parts instead of just one or three or four or five. There's some necessity for the division of labor. The farmer, as a matter of fact, can't really do his work, which is being a farmer, unless he has the tools for doing his work. He can't be a harness maker, for example. He wouldn't be able to plow his fields if he didn't have, and use his horses if he didn't have a harness maker or someone who could make a house. So the farmer can't do everything.
That do-it-yourself idea doesn't work. He wouldn't ever learn how to be good enough at so many things. That's one thing.
He wouldn't do his work well.
He wouldn't do it well.
The farmer, in order to do
takes a lifetime to learn how to do it.
You have to do it a whole lifetime, and it has to become a tradition. And in the family, and the children have to grow up on the farm and learn how to do it, just as the craftsman has to learn how to make the harness or make the furniture or the clothing or whatever it is. Has to spend a lifetime learning how to do that and be good at it. But you can see that it turns out that you don't have to have importers and exporters. You do have to.
Then you've gone too far, right?
You've gone too far.
You see, the pioneer, for example, had to be self-sufficient. That is, a single family would come out to Kansas 100 years ago and homestead, and that farmer had to do everything. He had to build his own house. He had to make his own clothes, make his own shoes. And we say, wow, but he was then living really beneath the human level. That is, he had to do it, but really, that's not a properly human life. He had to do everything. But the house he built was a sod shanty. It wasn't really
it wasn't a good house.
A good house. And he didn't have good tools. And when they broke, he had to stop, and then he couldn't get the harvest in because he had to become a craftsman just at the moment when it was desperately needed, and so to be a farmer. And so he had crop failures simply because of the time and so on. So that we do see a balance, a tension between simplicity and multiplicity. Now, the governing principle is always the simple. That is, the minimum governs the maximum. We know what the minimum is, and then we let it develop. We let it go to a certain extent, but there's always a control there. That is, you don't go too far, and when you do, you pare it back.
See, we would say that in modern society, we have not merely the division of labor. We have the atomization of labor. As it's become so divided that we have tremendous specialization. Everyone recognizes that ours is a highly specialized society. We don't have master craftsmen who have mastered the whole craft of carpentry. We have specialists doing so many different things in the society, so that nobody knows what's going on in building a house. We have the plumbers and the electricians and the carpenters and the plasterers and the cement people and the tile people, and the houses lose their own integrity as a result of this. We don't get a good piece of work, and we certainly we don't even have architects. We have all sorts of specialists who are doing things. That's at the extreme of the division of labor. That is the excess, and it really is an atomization of labor.
Oh, there's this idea of simplicity, of economy, is so rich. Like we said this before about Plato. He really doesn't go on with it. He raises this question, and there it stands as one of the great questions in all political philosophy. That is, it's a principle, and we'd be no longer talking exactly about the Republic if we went on and elaborated this idea. All we can do this afternoon is to do what Plato did. I think we can raise it. We can't make a definitive discourse about the principle of economy. It's a rich and fecund principle in itself. When you consider anything under the sun, if you want to measure its excellence, you have to say, well, what is its work? And you measure work by its beginning, that is necessary work by the principle of economy. wow, what an idea it is. Now, one of the elaborations, for example, that comes into work right away is play. That is, everybody who works discovers, when he becomes good at his work, that there's a kind of freedom even in the work. And so you not only get a house, but you get a house that's decorated. You get the principle of decoration. That is, we don't live in a hut with rude walls. The workman begins to love his work. And if he builds out of stone, he begins to carve the stone, or he arranges it in certain patterns, and begins to see that there's a delight, and a delight here means a kind of freedom and spontaneity, even in the very work that he does. And so the principle here of decoration comes into work. Now, that's not luxury. We're not talking.
No, it's essential.
It's essential.
You really have to have it. You have to have it
because we're human beings and we have spirits.
Yeah. See, you can say that the pioneer can live in his sod house and he can eke out a living. We say he can get along. He can even possibly raise a family and maybe scratch out a few crops on his land and live in this poverty-stricken way. But of course, when you go and meet this family, you say, well, you're living really below the level of human beings. You begin to become more and more like animals, and you lose. You don't rise up to the level of the human spirit, because a man is not just made
not just a body.
We say, but of course that's the first thing you have to take care of. If you don't take care of your body, well, then you'll die. And you won't be able to take care of your soul. And of course, you can't be a philosopher if you are struggling for physical existence, and you can't really have beauty in your home. If you can't have decoration in your home, if you have to exert every ounce of your energy and all of your time to simply living the bare essentials of life. Now that is not the desire of, that's not a just condition at all. But that's not the way societies really form. As soon as there is the opportunity for a little bit of leisure, when one is freed from the oppression of simply surviving, then these other matters begin to enter, because the human spirit demands them, craves them, hungers for them, needs them desperately in order to achieve the full human condition.
See, we go back to the great banquet of Odysseus. You don't just eat gruel for the rest of your life with a wooden spoon out of a bowl. Man must eat, but eating satisfies not only the body but the spirit. We must converse also, and so pretty soon, along with eating, you get cooking, and you get dishes and plates and spoons, and
I think you even get sherbet myself.
Well, I don't know. Now we have an argument. Now we have an argument. That is to say, how far do you go? Yeah. That is, we always have to find the limit of it. That is, there's a growth, an expansion, and then someone says, well, now wait a minute. Perhaps we've gone too far.
There seems to be a natural tendency toward excess. That is the
Plato is on the side of the simple, perhaps more than we would be. Certainly more than Glaucon and Adeimantus
yes.
are. They force Socrates to rather grudgingly concede, if not the sherbet, at least the cake.
Yes.
And he says, well, all right, for you fellows, I'll say, we'll have a baker, and so he concedes the baker reluctantly. There's a certain humor in this. We call Socrates holds up the Spartan ideal, which is rather
austere
and Carthusian, rather close to the minimum.
Yeah, well, Socrates himself was a poor man, very poor. And he lived an austere life.
Barely had a roof over his head, and didn't do too well with his family. His wife was always complaining about it for that reason. He didn't apparently have what we would consider to be a beautiful home. He didn't care about those things.
Well, he was not He's not a beautiful man. He's famous for being a homely man, even an ugly man. People made fun of him. They laughed at his he had a rather ugly face, but he was also very famous for his own austerity of life. That is, he was capable of getting along with very little in the way of food.
Bread and water, very little sleep.
Yeah, he could.
Very little in the way of clothes. He took the cold.
He went barefooted. Yeah. Sometimes, as a soldier, he'd be out in his sandals in the snow, and people said to him, "Socrates, I don't see how you can stand this." But it never seemed to bother him. He was capable of enduring great privation physically.
Much of the monastic ideal in Christendom derives from Plato. As somebody said, wasn't it Whitehead? Everything derives from Plato. That is, all Western thought, in one way or another, goes back to these rich ideas. When I say goes back to, I don't mean that there isn't. Of course, in a monastic ideal, there's grace and the whole order that comes from Christ, which, of course, is not in Socrates at all. But from the economic point of view, if you look at St. Benedict's rule, it's quite compatible with the kind of thing that Socrates is talking about here.
Well, it's even the condition of marriage among guardians may be a kind of groping toward the celibate life.
Yeah.
That is
it's a scandalous thing the way he presents it.
Yeah, and Aristotle completely rejected it. That is that they don't they don't even keep their own children. They don't even raise their own children.
They have their wives in common.
They have their wives in common. But it's I think what it is that the guardian is allowed to have nothing, you see. The point is that the guardian not only can't have property, he has no property whatever. He's utterly destitute in terms of property. He can't even have a wife and children. He really is a kind of monastic. Now,
he has to give up.
He's allowed to have children as a kind of necessity because, after all, the guardian race has to continue. If the guardians didn't have children, well, the guardian race, that is, the class of the guardians, wouldn't be perpetuated. You're not going to get guardians, or at least not very many out of the
eugenic
class.
Theory there about breeding guardians, which is, again, a perfectly reasonable theory. These things, of course, are scandalous to us, and they were, as a matter of fact, in his day. He presents them as paradoxes. I think we talked about that.
Yeah, well, he doesn't. These are speculations. You wouldn't say that it was absolutely necessary that the guardians not have wives and husbands, but on the other hand, it makes a certain kind of sense if you say that the ideal is that the guardians possess nothing, and they must have absolutely no distractions. They must not be distracted by the problems of child rearing, for example, or of marriage. You say, well, that sounds a little bit like the monastic life. Where the celibate life, say the priest who is not bothered by all of those things, he can dedicate himself entirely to God. And this, as we say, this is speculation. Plato isn't. This isn't a doctrine of Plato.
No, his doctrine is simplicity. That's a doctrine.
Right, and he's only following it out. He's speculating as a person does. They lay down a principle and they say, well, let's see. If that's the principle, then how would it apply? And
this might be so, this might be so. I think we always have to make that distinction between when Plato lays down a principle, that's one thing. When he speculates about the application of that principle, that's another thing. And it's kept, I think, well, maybe I better not finish that sentence. I was going to say it's kept clear, but that's not true, is it? It's not kept clear, always. No. That is, Socrates talks freely, and his readers ever since have sometimes quarreled. Well, does he really mean that, or is he just speculating? And there is some room for doubt in many cases, although by and large I don't think there's any room for doubt. I think we can see by and large that the principles are very, very clear. And that the speculation is of a different order.
Well, one of the principles and one of the Socratic principles is that you must clearly distinguish between principles and the application
right.
of principles. And of course, the application of principles is very difficult. There's no certainty.
And there's no absolute certainty about it.
About an application.
That's why you need governance.
Yeah.
Again, you have to have somebody govern simply because the application can't be stipulated once and for all. There are those who think that you can turn politics into a geometry. Spinoza, you remember, tried to turn ethics into a geometry. Spinoza argued that if you could get the principles, well, then you could just work it out and write a book, and that would be ethics, and you'd never have to govern again. That's not true.
They used to call it the ethical calculus. They called it. A man wrote a book in the 18th century called The Ethical Calculus. As if you just say, well, here's the problem and here's the case, and we just work out a formula, and the answer is do it or don't do it, and it'll just work out mathematically.
Work it out to certain decimal places.
Yeah.
You know.
But that's not true.
Obviously not true, and that's why we need governance. We always, and that's not only true of the state; it's true of ourselves. That is, you can study all the ethics in the world and all the moral theology in the world and still not be a good man. The good man has to govern himself. He has to have good habits. He has to be virtuous. He has to practice virtue. The knowledge, the calculus, isn't going to work in the ethical and in the political order.
But it's quite clear that it's very easy for us